So, as part of our kickoff series in our podcast, this series will be on change management in the INGO sector. Today, I will be interviewing Monica Maassen. She is currently the head of change management, learning, and change communications at Oxfam International. In a separate podcast episode, or actually a series, which I plan for later on in 2020, that will be focused on leading culture change, I will actually interview Monica again about Oxfam's ongoing work on organizational culture, which it has embarked on in recent year after a difficult experience that involved allegations of sexual abuse and harassment, and which led to a longer-term exploration of Oxfam's culture, the strengths of its cultures, as well as aspects that may need to change. So as I talk today with Monica, I just want to tell you a quick personal story of how I became aware of and involved in the change management work of Oxfam. I had been doing some other work on change management with other peer NGOs for about 15 years or so. I find it fascinating work. I have deep admiration for the people who need to design and shepherd and lead this kind of change management process throughout the organization, because it's incredibly complex work. As part of this, I became involved as a consultant in some of Oxfam's organizational learning about its precursor to its current large-scale Oxfam 2020 initiative. And I have been able to observe Monica as a change manager for about 10 years now. And I have been able to debrief with her along the way on what Monica has been learning as she deepened her skills as a change management lead. Monica is, before she joined in the current role as in change management learning and change communication, she was also the head of Oxfam International's organizational effectiveness. Earlier on, let me know, Monica, if I've got it wrong. Monica was the deputy director for change management for the Oxfam 2020 process before that, and the head of change management at Oxfam Novib, which is the Dutch affiliate of Oxfam. So we're talking, I think, at least 15 years, if not more, you tell me, of change management experience. Did I get that right, Monica?
Yeah, I think you're right. I must admit, on these kind of things, I stopped counting the years. I just, I move from one thing to the other. And then it's really like a journey where, you don't count the days, but you look where you're going instead of looking back.
Oh, maybe there is some, maybe you're already starting to download some reflections then. But let's first talk about what the heck are we actually talking about? Change management is such an abstract term for the average NGO leader or manager who might be listening into our podcast episode today. So tell me a little bit about what components do you think change management typically consists of, and what do you as a lead change manager do on a daily basis? What should people imagine?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. And I must say, I struggle sometimes with the word change management, because sometimes it assumes that you manage the change and that it is all controllable. And I think that is not always the case. It really depends on the situation and the type of change that you're involved in. So, so it is a sort of, it's a word that people are using quite often, and it's that's nice. But but sort of what do you do? And well, of course, it really depends on the situation. But I think the basic story is as follows: is that an organization has a mission, a vision. It's what it wants to achieve, and that is driving a lot of the daily activities of the organization, and it's also what is driving people. But it's really important to think how you organize yourself in delivering that mission and vision. And sometimes when you change your strategy, or when there are external situations like a changed financial situation or a crisis, or can be many different reasons, many different drivers for change, you think, hey, not only the strategy needs to change, but also the way we are organized needs to change, the how we are doing things. And of course, in the ideal world, the how, so how the organization is set up and functioning, is closely, related to the mission and vision.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes you see that these two and yeah, sort of things need to change. And then you start working with change management. So you start supporting that process of change, reflecting with people on how you can best organize internally, how you can increase, for instance, the legitimacy of the organization, or how you can strengthen the efficiency of and effectiveness of the organization, or how you can best deal with a new setting where funding has changed so much that you need to reorganize. So sometimes really ordinary budget cuts are a driver for change, but
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it is much more change on strategy and you want to adapt to that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So what I hear you say is that when changes in strategy are needed, often they need to be accompanied by changes in either structures, which is actually, in my experience, what people most immediately think of. But you also emphasize changes in ways of working. So there could be changes in what business processes or systems through which staff and NGO work, right?
Yeah,
Or changes in the types of people one hires or promotes or wants to have more of, and perhaps sometimes changes in culture as well, which, as I said, we'll talk about separately. Is
yeah,
that?
yeah. Although for me, it is a critical element of change management, because that is the problem quite often when leaders and managers think about change management. They overemphasize quite often the
Mm,
structure side,
yeah.
so it's we need a new way of organizing our department, our organization, or the relationship between different parts of the organization. So quite easily people move to the structure side. And quite often if you hear people, there's a problem in an organization, well, maybe we need a restructuring. Well, for
Mm-hmm.
me, that is not, real change management, because it is very much also how do people behave, what are the informal rules in an organization, what matters, etc. So it's the much more difficult part, but it is as important or even more important. But yeah, it's less concrete sometimes for people. So
Definitely. And I could not agree more with you because it's so important. The organizational culture, what is still supportive of new strategy and what needs to change as a result of new strategy and new external circumstances. Because it's so complex, I do want to get back to you on that in a separate episode so that we can really unpack that, because I think we both feel that it's very important, but there's also a fair amount of confusion about the topic,
yeah,
I would
yeah.
say. So if we artificially set aside changes in ways of working, as in behaviors, habits, and culture, etc., for the moment, um, what have you found across your 15 years plus of experience in change management? What have you found most interesting, most rewarding about what I'll call the art and the science of change management?
Yeah. So what I find most exciting is sort of, well, for instance, at the start of a process, if you can really build a strong case for change, so that the drivers for change um, are really clear, and if they are accepted by staff, for me that is a milestone moment. And it's so important to get that right, so that people understand why change is needed. And it's so critical, because what you see quite often is that people, if you don't do it well, that people are defensive because they interpret it as if how they do it now is wrong, which
Exactly.
is not necessarily the case, but it doesn't fit anymore for either for the new strategy or for the new context, or it was helpful in the past but not now anymore. But I think it's really critical that people understand it, and buy into that.
Mm.
And that's really critical. And what you see quite often in that phase is that there's a certain small group of people, the leaders of the change, although it can be, you never know how change starts. Sometimes it starts because a group of staff is really pushing for it, and in other moments it is the leaders who really say, we need to change, or it's a mix. But what you see quite often is that there is a small group engaged and involved in the need for that change, and they are ahead of the curve.
Mm-hmm.
And then think that if they explain once, why we need to change, that then everyone gets it and accepts it and follows it. But it really needs time and a lot of attention, and also a bit of patience in the sense of, repeating why, and going into conversations. And so if you have that right, I think then, change is not that it's it's not easy always, but I think it's really a critical phase. And if you get that, if you're sitting in a room with people and you hear that people are buying that, well, quite often change is also painful because it's about, it's people losing jobs sometimes or having to change or whatever. But if that acceptance, if that is there,
Mm.
I think that's really good. That's the thing that I really like. And what I also like is there's the hard part of change management, which is really about HR processes, looking at new, maybe new roles need to be defined and all these kind of things. But what I like the most is the learning part of a change process, because I think you need a certain level of design in the beginning of a change process, in the direction of where it's going. Sometimes, quite specific decisions. But especially if you're working for larger organizations and in a complex setting like our sector, then
Mm.
things don't always go exactly like you predict in advance. And the design on paper might be really nice, but things happen afterwards. People respond differently. Yeah, so it's dynamic. So if you can in that next phase of the change, if you get the space in the organization and people understand the importance of learning, that is also I find a very interesting phase that find really exciting also. If you sit together with people who are piloting some of the change, and you can sit together and exchange and say, hey, this is coming out, so this is different from how we had designed it,
Mm-hmm.
but we can adapt it, etc. I think that's also I think really inspiring.
Very interesting. Yeah. I may get back to you if we have time at the end about, so you emphasize very much the kind of how to build the case for change, as you said, and the sense of urgency around that. Let's see if we have time towards the end to come back to the change champions, which I would like to talk to you about. But let me first move to the kind of the mirror question to what I just asked you. And that is, there are also many things about change management, in my experience at least, that are incredibly complex and sometimes very difficult or trying or frustrating. Tell me your experience. What have you found most trying about change management as a profession, or as an act, as a role you play?
Well, I think I already hinted to it a bit. Change also sometimes comes with painful decisions,
Mm,
where either organizations or people have to let go their own role or a whole way of working that they have really invested in for years, and then you know you come with a process and say, well, thank you so much, but we don't need that anymore in the future, or you have to change, or we don't know whether there's a role for you. And I think that always is difficult in whatever type of organization, but in general, in organizations like in Oxfam, you have people, who are really committed. They are not only working there because of their salary, but they are motivated to contribute to change, and so they are committed, and then it's really painful sometimes and difficult to say, uh, um, that people, that take these kind of difficult decisions,
yeah.
and to inform people, and that is a difficult part. And it requires really strong collaboration with HR, human resources. So
Mm,
for me, that is, if you look at critical success factors,
mm-hmm.
that is also one of the critical success factors. Really strong collaboration with the HR team and people. And quite often you need also really additional capacity there, because going through a process of change requires so much change at these kind of contracts, a selection process, conversations about people that have to leave. So, and it's so important for good change processes that is done in a careful way. We're really valuing people, that people feel safe, that they know when things are done, that it's done in a proper and transparent way, that there are checks and balances in the process. So the quality of the HR process is really critical for it can make and break a change process, I think.
Let me follow up a little bit on that. Do you think that in addition to that, and I'm so glad you mentioned that, in addition to that really strong collaboration with HR, that you also need a really aligned official leader, so those who have positional power, who will aligned with the change management effort in terms of how they communicate to those people who experience pain or grieving, let's say, as a result of the change process that is taking place, so that you, the persons involved here messaging, and I don't mean this kind of from a PR perspective, but I hear messages that are sensitive in the same ways that HR is working with you.
Yeah, that's extremely critical. And you see in change processes that some people are really better in that than other people are. So one is to have these kind of difficult conversations, but also the ability to take difficult decisions, because what you also see is that sometimes, especially when uh, um, for instance, the size of the team, is getting smaller, and painful decisions have to be taken, that you see that sometimes you have managers who find it difficult to say that someone who has been working in a job for 20 years, then you have to say, no, you're not, you can't stay anymore. So then sometimes you see that, the message gets more blurry, or the wrong decisions are taken because of it's too painful. It requires a lot of skills from managers, and also, to sort of there in a change process. Quite often there is a moment where you see there comes pushback from staff, saying that this process is not fair, or this is not. And of course, you sometimes, as a leader, also you feel the pain and you want to support your people. So you can quite easily say, yeah, no, the board of directors or the others, yeah, it's easy to then sort of also start complaining, but really standing then together and still listening, because that is the art of doing the two, sort of listening to your stuff, acknowledging the pain and the frustration, and also the uncertainty that sometimes there is, and at the same time, daring to take difficult decisions. That's not easy. So in a good when you have time in a change process, and that's also not always the case. So if you have sudden financial situations, you have to rush more than if you know that the process is coming. But then you do a phased approach where you really work with leaders first in support them in this process, and say, what is important, how can you have these conversations, making sure that people really understand, and own as much the change as the most senior leadership. So that's really important.
Yeah, and that is why I have such admiration for people like you and other change managers especially in mid to large size complex NGOs, because it is incredibly complex. The people aspect is very, very complex, and then the power aspect is also very complex. And I'm not sure we'll get today to the power aspects entirely, but that's why I am so endlessly fascinated by this topic. So, as you know, there are many kinds of frameworks and concepts and tools to help you as change manager and myself as a consultant to change managers to think about and to design and execute change management processes. So let me ask you, which frameworks or tools have you found most helpful in the Oxfam setting?
Yeah, that's
Or
I
are
am
there none?
that's quite interesting. So I am not so that's yeah, it's an interesting question, because in a change process sometimes we also work together with external advisors, etc. And then you see people coming in with models and etc. And sort of I read a lot, and also engage with people externally, and sometimes do a training. But for me, I don't have one model or one
Mm-hmm.
thing. So at the moment, for me, I think I really read a lot about the consequences of complexity.
Mm.
So looking at an organization as a complex adaptive system, as an organic type of organization, which is not where everything can be totally planned and controlled, but which is developing much more. It's more emerging change, but still
Mm-hmm.
it can also be transformational. But where you don't exactly know, sort of how things will go, because there's so many factors involved, so many things changing, so many interdependencies, and in the end, it's all about it's about people, and people respond to whatever happens, and you can't always predict all how people respond. So at the moment, I'm reading a lot on about sort of the implications of complexity for leadership, for
Hmm.
change,
Well,
etc.
maybe you can tell us one author or one model or anything within complex adaptive systems thinking, which after all is it's so abstract, right? That's my difficulty with that. It's fairly abstract. Who do you find is thinking most concretely in a helpful way in the NGO setting about that?
Oh well, there are really many. So you have much more theoretical articles, and you have very practical. So a few weeks back, a colleague and myself, we did a very simple brown bag lunch about mind traps of leaders
Ah,
in dealing with complexity, by Jennifer Barker.
I think it's Jennifer Garvey Berger.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, yes,
Sorry
I
for
like her
that.
work. Mm-hmm.
And it's so concrete. It's really, it's not very abstract, etc. It's really about what are the mind traps, so that you go, for instance, much too much into comply. So if there's a situation you think you can solve it with rules and procedures, and insisting on delivery, etc. Where in certain situations that is really important if you're in a very concrete situation, when it is about your financing, your accounting and everything. Don't get then into complexity thinking, because your figures in the end need to match. So that's
Add
not
up.
where add up. So it's but there are many situations where it's in the complexity domain, where you can't predict everything. And I think that is what Oxfam has learned also over the past 2 years, sort of with the what is called the safeguarding crisis. Who would ever have predicted that
Mm.
a situation in 2011 in Haiti would trigger sort of one of the largest crises in Oxfam. Things are, especially with a digital world, and with connectivity, there's so much more that we can't predict. So you need more ways of leading and managing, and in that accept and understand that complexity.
Got it. Well, so we'll put in the show notes for this episode, we'll put a connection to Jennifer Garvey Berger's work, and particularly her concept on mind traps, which I think is in her most recent book that
Yeah, yeah.
I also have had a look at. Um, so one thing that I find a number of change managers as well as change leaders have a harder time thinking about, which is which is what sometimes is called the political frame. If I think about
Mm,
a couple of
mm,
authors, one of those sets of frameworks that I personally, as a former academic and as a leadership trainer and as a consultant, find helpful is by Ballman and Deal. And without going into a model now, I just want to highlight and see what you think about the political frame. So this is the idea that the organization, as it's going through change, or in fact at all times, but also when it goes through change, is also a jungle where people fight for access to the attention of senior leaders. They fight for budgets, they fight for positions, for campaigning positions, right? They sometimes have interpersonal rivalry, etc. So how do you as a change manager use the political frame at times in a way where it's not a dirty tactic? I certainly don't want to imply that. This is politics for the sake of accomplishing the mission and making sure that your change management process is not going to get scuttled because of political, with a small p, maneuvering by some other actors that are influential. How do you, from a political frame, try to think and act in your change management role?
Well, I think this is something which is extremely relevant for Oxfam, because I think for different reasons. One is that I think the identity of Oxfam, the values and ways of working, has strong political component. It is a campaigning organization. It's an influencing organization, and you can imagine that the skills and the passion that requires is not only used externally but also
Nope.
internally. So
Yes.
I think that's something that yeah, sort of yeah, it's part of Oxfam. And the other thing is that Oxfam is, and that's really also so critical to understand, is that Oxfam is a confederation
Mm,
of 20 affiliates. So there is not one senior leader nor a change director or change manager that sort of can sort of decide on anything and say this is how things are going. It always
absolutely.
needs the buy-in of uh, uh, of of the leaders, and yeah, these leaders are also again sort of then the positions they take are informed by all kinds of political processes. So this is yeah, one of the most challenging parts of a change process in an organization like Oxfam, because sort of if you think about the change process uh, as a phased process where you start with first agreeing on the drivers for change. Why do we have to change? What is the issue? Why are we changing? And then you go into a sort of design process of where you want to go, and then you start implementing. You can imagine that in that whole process there is a lot of political negotiations
Mm,
taking place, and sometimes from implementation process decisions are taken which are political, probably the only way forward, but are not always the most efficient and strategic decisions for from my perspective, for others. So that is a challenging and it is a challenge. And after an article from Duncan Green about how change happens externally, he was calling it dancing with the system. So it is sometimes what you have to do is to dance with the system, and that, yes, is sometimes you move a bit along, and then you try to direct the dance into another direction, etc. And yeah, that is challenging, and it is an additional complexity of the role of a change manager, and it is built. I think what really matters is relationships. So knowing the right people. Internal communication is a really critical factor in that,
okay.
and that is also changing. So when we started the Oxfam 2020 change, we had of course internet and everything, but we didn't have a strong internal platform like Facebook or Workplace. Now we have. So now people across the confederation can input and influence where that wasn't the case in the past. So these kind of factors can play an important role. So yeah, so it is really challenging, and that is where I have learned, that you have almost like a toolkit of things that you can use to influence also in that process, in that political process. And one, of course, is your knowledge and experience about how change happens. So you can advise leaders on how this happens. But the other is external people. Sometimes, it's helpful to bring in external expertise to influence the process. And the other is, and that's what I mentioned in the beginning, is learning. So so what sometimes doesn't help is if I say, I think this is how things should go. But if I facilitate the learning process where a number of people come together and together conclude that this is, is what it needs to happen, then the likelihood that will influence a political process is stronger.
Interesting. Yeah. I do remember when I did that little bit of work with you all years ago around single management system, the precursor to Oxfam 2020, that I did say in my presentation, I'm struck by how Oxfam is so articulate in how change happens, that whole approach and way of thinking externally. And I references Duncan Green's work then, but I'm struck that you should really apply it a little bit more internally, and it sounds like indeed that has been happening.
Yeah.
So maybe then my last question is, talk to us a little bit about how you and your change management teams, how you go about learning in formal and informal ways. So learning about what's happening in the change process, what is more or less on track, even though you can't direct or control anything, where you need to adapt and be agile, where there are inflection points, etc. How do you go about that learning formally and informally, so that it's not just in your head, kind of tacit knowledge, but it's actually something that can be shared with others and that can be documented in a certain way so that future change managers can also use it?
Yeah. Well, I think that last is that documenting is one of the most difficult, because quite often then we are already in a next process, so we move on and don't always take time to document well. So that is a challenge. But I think again, it's important to realize that Oxfam is an organization. If you think about, we have something like 100 locations, because we work in 67 countries. We have 20 affiliates. We have a number of advocacy offices. So we have 100 locations. So to have that overview of what is happening and to learn from everything is mission impossible.
Yeah.
But so you try to learn strategically by focusing on a number of things. So that can be sort of in a change process where, quite often you start with pilot processes. So you don't implement something everywhere at the same time. So that can be, in a region. So what Oxfam did, for instance, with 2020 is we started in implementing the change in Latin America and in the Pacific and in Southern Africa. These are a bit smaller regions with smaller budgets. So there's a bit more a safe space to pilot and to learn. So that is where we started with 2020. And then sort of you identify in these regions people, change managers, leaders that sort of are quite involved, and you bring them together. So we had, for instance, in that process, we had every 2 weeks a call with change managers across the globe, exchanging. So that was very informal learning, just every day on very practical things, but also sometimes more deeper. But we also did some more structured learning. For instance, one that I always still like a lot is so if we do a humanitarian response in, for instance, Somalia or Yemen, we do a few weeks after we started the response, we already do a rapid learning exercise, because in humanitarian response it's really critical to learn immediately, because if you wait too long with learning and evaluating, then sort of, the response is done, and that's not really helpful. So we used that methodology. We adapted it for the change and said we do the same.
Nice.
And the methodology is not also having an external a person coming in, sorry, but it's also, who are, choosing, for instance, 10 people, and everyone is interviewing 4 people and bringing in all these interviews and then learning the lessons. So that was one way of how we did it. So you can do it fast. And also by inviting 10 people to do the interviews, they are learning, and sometimes they were change managers or they were HR people. So people that were already engaged somewhere, somehow in change processes, they were part of the learning process.
And so may I ask then, so when you do these quick interviews in a kind of distributed way, you all ask each other a couple of similar questions so you can compare the answers. And the questions are focused around how did something happen and why did it happen and what worked and what not. That type of question. Okay, and then and those are short interviews, 15-20 minutes. And then everybody brings that into the call.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, in the call, and not only, and so we did also sort of, we brought it together, and then 1 or 2 people did a more thorough analysis of all the answers and made a small report, but also, and then also with some concrete recommendations immediately, because that is also the parallel with the humanitarian response. You don't do the lessons just for the lessons, but because you immediately want to implement. So these learning reviews ended with very clear recommendations for different stakeholders, because that is also one of the challenges when you work on change in Oxfam, is that you have so many different stakeholders. You have affiliates, you have countries, you have OI, you have humanitarian people. So you have so many different stakeholders in such a process. So, the recommendations were, for the different stakeholders organized. So, and then we brought that back in different locations in the organization. So that was one way of doing. But we also did a more, where we invited around 30 people who were really involved in the change for 1 week, where we really, with external facilitation, went through a learning process, and did a bit the same that we did with that short review, but then going more deeper, and
Okay, very interesting. I loved what you told me about the rapid learning exercise, because it also is consistent with what you talked about organizations going through change as being complex systems, and there are a lot of feedback loops, and so you need to be very agile in capturing your observations on what's happening, what's working, what's not working, and then, as you say, come out with rapid, quick, clear recommendations so that people in the change have kind of a sense of how they want to move forward till you reconvene. I love it.
Yep.
Well, Monica, you truly have a wealth of knowledge about change management. So if people want to reach you after this this episode, how can they reach you? Should they look for you on LinkedIn, on other channels, email?
Yes. Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, so that's easy. And they can also email me. So I think you will put it under the...
If that's okay with you, I'll put it in the show notes. Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing a bit of your learning today with us about this immensely interesting but very complex topic of change management in INGO settings. And I will be sure to reach out to you again later in 2020 to plan, as part of a series on organizational culture and culture change, to talk with you once again. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you also, because I think one way of learning has always been for me also talking with other people outside Oxfam. to reflect about what is happening internally. And we have over the years had many different conversations, and yeah, that was always for me a reflective moment, and to also bring critical thinking in. Or yeah, so thank you for that too.
Oh, that's very kind of you. I have learned and you have learned, so that's a good thing. Till we talk again.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.